Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Help be discharged from further consideration of S-2843 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? The senator from Washington.
Madam President, reserving the right to object.
Without objection.
This is outrageous. On September 27th, there were over 80,000 new COVID-19 cases and over 1,000 COVID-19 deaths in our country. And yet the next day I had to come to the Senate floor to explain why undermining our efforts to end this pandemic would be reckless. And now 2 days and thousands more cases and deaths later, I have to do it again. And this is the second time today Republicans have tried to do something like this. This virus has killed over 685,000 people in our country. And if people do not get vaccinated, variants like Delta will continue to spread, undermine our economy, and take lives. So why in the world, for the second time in a week, do I have to come down here and explain to some of my Republican colleagues that weakening one of our strongest tools to fight this virus is a dangerous and deadly idea? Getting people vaccinated is one of the most important things we can do to stop COVID-19. And let's be clear, immunization requirements are nothing new in this country. So I hope we can stop with this political theater and focus on ending this pandemic, rebuilding our economy, and keeping people alive. I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, immunizations are nothing new. To a degree, immunization requirements might not be new, but sweeping immunization mandates issued by a single individual within the federal government, that is the President of the United States, are entirely new, entirely unprecedented, entirely unfounded, and dangerous to our constitutional order, to say nothing of its tendency to discourage those who have been reluctant to get the vaccine from getting it. So I've returned to the Senate floor today for the third time this week to express my profound objections to that sweeping mandate, to President Biden's sweeping, promised and still inchoate vaccine mandate, and to offer legislation that this body could have passed right now. It could have passed in order to protect countless Americans from this federal intrusion. Now, look, the federal government has no legitimate role mandating COVID-19 vaccination for all Americans. In fact, the President of the United States has acknowledged that. It doesn't have that role. It doesn't belong to this government. Yes, there have been vaccine mandates in the past. They have never been from the federal government, directed at the entire country. During a really difficult time, economically and otherwise, in which inflation and the jobs market are causing a whole lot of businesses around the country to have to close their doors, President Biden has announced that he's going to enforce this mandate with a really hefty fine. Each incident of a business not fulfilling the mandate could cost a business $14,000. President Biden, under the threat of massive punishment, is co-opting businesses to enforce his mandate. They'll have to police their workforce's personal medical decisions and order the receipt of a vaccination, or alternatively, be forced into bankruptcy. Now, some on the other side of the aisle think that the president's punishment doesn't go far enough. In fact, in the reconciliation bill draft currently being circulated on the other end of the Capitol in the House of Representatives, Democrats are pushing to increase the fine to $70,000 per violation. Look, unvaccinated Americans are not the enemy. They're not the virus, and they're certainly not the enemy. Some are frontline doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals who worked overtime throughout the pandemic, throughout the darkest of the dark hours of the pandemic, treating patients and saving lives. Others are workers whose industries were deemed essential and who showed up to work to ensure Americans kept having access to food and electricity and other essential items and services. Others still are simply neighbors, family members, and other loved ones who have supported friends, families, and entire communities as Americans as a whole struggled through quarantines, shutdowns, financial difficulties, and social isolation. Let me reiterate, as I've said many times before, and I will continue to repeat, I believe the vaccine's development is nothing short of a miracle. It's an answer to prayer. I've been fully vaccinated, as has every member of my family, with my encouragement. But we certainly should not be forcing employers through the federal government without congressional authorization or constitutional authority, putting employers in a position where they have to fire some of their most valuable and now increasingly hard to find workers. We shouldn't be threatening business owners with closure simply because they don't have any desire to police their workforce's personal medical decisions. It's not who we are as a country. I don't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent or a libertarian. Americans as a whole don't believe that that's who we are. We're not into that kind of draconian micromanagement associated with the nanny state, nor are we into the excessive accumulation of power in the hands of the few, or even worse, in the hands of one person. Many simply cannot incur the cost of this enforcement, certainly not in this economy. Additionally, this fine really amounts to a tax. It's government revenue collected from the American people, and the Constitution has a thing or two to say about how revenue bills must be enacted. The Constitution does not vest any taxing, or for that matter, any other revenue-raising or fining authorities in the president alone. No, this is a power that's reserved to the people's representatives in Congress who are charged with precisely that responsibility. We have exclusively that authority, and that authority is not to be exercised by the President of the United States. It's no accident that the Founding Fathers, through the Constitution, put this power in the hands of those people occupying positions in the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals, and in no one else within our government. President Biden's mandate would impose really significant costs on Americans, on American businesses, and on our nation's economy. It's already in some really rough times. Look, it's unconstitutional. It hasn't been passed by Congress. It's wrong for America. And that's why today, as I did yesterday and the day before, I came here to offer a proposal that, if enacted, as we could have enacted it today, it would protect Americans from some of the most disastrous effects of the mandate. Well, I believe the mandate will, I'm quite certain, eventually be invalidated in court. It's going to take some time for us to get there because right now we don't even have the mandate itself, we just have the threat of the mandate, and it's the imminent apprehension of the mandate's eventual issuance that's causing HR departments and general counsel's offices in corporate America throughout this country today to scurry, to try to get ahead of the curve, and to develop their own policies so that they're in compliance as of day one when the mandate hits. But in the meantime, there's nothing to sue, there's no one to sue, because there's no final agency action. There's no order in place. There's just the threat of it. This, I fear, is a feature, not a bug. Because by the time we actually have something on which to sue, by the time lawsuits are brought, by the time that litigation works its way to its natural conclusion, which I believe inevitably culminates in a finding that it's invalid, it's unconstitutional, it's not warranted by law, months, if not years, will have elapsed, and a lot of the damage will be done. So until that day that I consider inevitable, when a court rules that this is unlawful, these bills, like the one that I've offered today, can provide businesses and the American people with the certainty that they need to make their own decisions. My bill that I've offered up today, the No Taxation Without Congressional Consent Act, would prohibit OSHA and other executive branch agencies in the federal government from imposing fines, fees, or taxes with respect to these mandates. It would protect our constitutional order by requiring that revenue measures be voted on by Congress, the branch of government most accountable to the people, and the only branch of government empowered to enact such policies. The other two branches cannot. As I mentioned yesterday, Madam President, the people concerned about this mandate are everyday Americans. I've now heard from 158 Utahns who are at risk of losing their jobs due to the mandate, and that number continues to grow every day. They are not our enemies, they are our neighbors. Many of them have been advised by board-certified doctors that they ought to not receive the vaccine. We shouldn't be punishing them or forcing them into second-class status. So today we have a choice. I hope that at some point my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will allow us to provide the certainty and peace of mind to those individuals and businesses at risk of suffering under the mandate. We can defend Congress's role as the branch of government that determines how and from whom revenue is to be raised. Not only can we do that, but we have an obligation to do that. We've all sworn an oath to uphold and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, and that document doesn't give the President this power. In fact, that document prohibits the President from exercising this power in the absence of congressional authorization, which we have not provided. So this bill, one of a dozen that I've submitted, could have passed this body today. I wish, for the sake of millions of concerned Americans, that it had. But regardless of this result today and of the objection that precluded it from passing the Senate today, I'm going to continue to fight. I'll keep coming back for as long as it takes in order to end this egregious and legally baseless and unconstitutional mandate. I find it interesting that my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from the state of Washington, referred to this as outrageous that we would be attempting to put in place protections for those Americans who are going to be victimized by the vaccine, who are going to have to choose between, on the one hand, receiving a medical procedure that they don't want, and on the other hand, being fired. Nobody should have to choose between submission and financial ruin. They especially shouldn't have to do that under the direction of an invalid, unconstitutional directive by the federal government. She also referred to what she described as, quote unquote, our efforts to, quote unquote, end this pandemic. This isn't about whether we want to end the pandemic. There's not a single person, Democrat, Republican, Independent, in this chamber or in the other chamber. I'm not sure I know a single American anywhere who wouldn't want to end this pandemic. This is not the pandemic. This is not going to end the pandemic. If anything, this will cause more people to be more reluctant to get the very vaccine that they're wanting to encourage others to provide. This is not about that. The minute we lose control of the government that is supposed to work for us, the minute we start to erode willfully, even for those who might be convinced that it's good policy, and I would disagree with them on that, the minute we decide to give this power to the President of the United States and stand silently as he usurps authority that under Article 1, Section 7 and Article 1, Section 8 plainly belongs only to Congress to the extent we have any business operating in this area to begin with as a federal government, which we do not, then we've simultaneously undermined both the vertical protection that we call federalism and the horizontal protection that we call separation of powers. Now, lest anyone might be left with the impression that this would be an esoteric or academic exercise, or that that's not something that affects their freedom, for those who would make that suggestion, they are sorely mistaken. You see, because anyone, anywhere, can have a Bill of Rights. In fact, as the late Justice Antonin Scalia used to point out, any tin-horn dictator around the world can have a Bill of Rights, and most of them do. Many of those Bills of Rights are scintillating documents. They're glowing in terms of their expression of individuality and the right of each human to exist and flourish. They'll articulate a list of rights that is in some cases comparable to, if not even more protective of individual liberty than our own Bill of Rights. And yet, as Justice Scalia continued, whether or not that Bill of Rights or any Bill of Rights is worth more than the paper that it's printed on ultimately rests on whether there are protections in place that guard against the dangerous accumulation of power in the hands of the few. That's what makes that difference. So if we allow a president today to adopt, whether you want to call it a tax or a fine or whatever revenue-raising tool that you choose to identify this as being, the president doesn't have the power to impose that. That's a legislative function. And Article 1, Section 7 is very clear. You cannot enact legislation, including any legislation collecting revenue from the citizenry, without passage in the House, passage in the Senate, and presentment to the President of the United States. He can't do it alone. That's what this is about. This is about so much more than just this vaccine mandate. But this vaccine mandate in and of itself is wrong, it's unconstitutional, it's harmful, and it has a tendency to undermine the very interests the President purports to be advancing. Thank you, Madam President.